The restaurant was alive with soft golden light, the murmur of conversation, and the rhythmic clinking of glasses against polished wood. It was the kind of place that prided itself on quiet elegance, a sanctuary for the city's wealthiest to escape the chaos outside. At table 7, however, the harmony was disrupted by the presence of a man whose very aura seemed to bend the atmosphere around him. Alexander Royce sat rigid in his chair, his broad shoulders tense beneath his tailored charcoal gray suit. His dark hair, combed immaculately back, caught the warm glow of the chandelier, but his face was stone, carved into the kind of expression that made people look away rather than risk eye contact. The waiter had just set down his plate, a perfectly seared ribeye, paired with asparagus tips and roasted potatoes arranged in meticulous symmetry. But Alexander's eyes, sharp and cold as steel, lingered on the dish like it was an insult. He pressed his lips into a thin line, his jaw flexing. He was not a man accustomed to disappointment, certainly not in a restaurant that charged $500 for a bottle of wine. Around him, a subtle shift took place. Patrons at neighboring tables whispered behind champagne flutes, recognizing the man whose face had appeared on magazine covers, whose name was synonymous with business empires and headlines that often carried words like ruthless, relentless, untouchable. Alexander Royce wasn't just a billionaire, he was a symbol of power, the kind that intimidated anyone within his orbit. Yet here he sat, his silence more threatening than a raised voice. Finally, with deliberate slowness, he lifted his knife, cut into the steak, and examined the slice beneath the gleaming blade. Too much red, barely warm at the center. His expression shifted from cold neutrality to something far sharper, a flicker of anger rising like a storm behind his eyes. This, he muttered under his breath, his voice deep and controlled, as unacceptable. He set the knife down with a sharp clink that drew the attention of a nearby busboy. Then, without hesitation, he grabbed the linen napkin from his lap, folded it once with precision, and tossed it onto the plate as though dismissing the entire effort. The sound of fabric hitting porcelain was quiet, but it carried weight, like the drop of a gavel. Layla, the waitress assigned to his table, had been standing a few feet away, her notepad clutched tightly against her apron. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, with dark hair tied back in a neat ponytail and a face that bore the soft weariness of someone used to long hours and difficult customers. She had served demanding clients before, but this man radiated a different energy. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make a scene, yet every movement declared his displeasure like a verdict. "I'm terribly sorry, sir," she began cautiously, stepping forward. "If the steak isn't to your liking, I can." He cut her off with a raised hand, his palm slicing through the air like a blade. His gaze didn't even meet hers. He was already pushing his chair back, the leather groaning against the polished floor. "Enough," Alexander said curtly, his tone final, brooking no argument. Layla froze, the apology dying in her throat. She wanted to insist, to reassure him that the kitchen could remake the dish exactly to his standards, but something about the way he carried himself silenced her. He wasn't just displeased about food, there was something deeper, heavier beneath his anger. She could sense it in the way his fists clenched briefly at his sides before he reached into his jacket pocket. Without ceremony, Alexander pulled out a thick leather wallet and peeled off several crisp $100 bills. He tossed them onto the table, with such force that they slid across the linen and fluttered to the edge, nearly falling to the floor. Patrons nearby exchanged looks, shock, disapproval, curiosity, but no one dared speak. "Pathetic," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for those closest to hear. Layla's throat tightened. The word wasn't directed at her, not exactly, but it landed like a blow. She stood rooted to the spot as Alexander turned sharply, striding toward the door with long, purposeful steps. His presence, even in retreat, demanded attention. Waiters moved out of his path instinctively, and the maitre d' glanced nervously but made no move to stop him. The restaurant seemed to exhale collectively once he passed, conversations picking up in hushed tones, like the cautious buzz after a lightning strike. Yet Layla remained still, her eyes fixed on the man's retreating back. Something about the scene gnawed at her chest. Yes, wealthy clients often carried arrogance like armor, but this felt different. His anger wasn't wild or theatrical, it was precise, contained, and yet fueled by something rawer than undercooked steak. She thought of how he hadn't so much as looked at her. His anger wasn't personal, and yet it was. She could almost see the invisible weight he carried on his shoulders, disguised as cold authority. She had grown up around men who tried to bury their pain beneath stern expressions and harsh words. It was familiar, too familiar. For a moment, she considered letting him go. After all, it wasn't her job to chase after customers, especially ones who clearly didn't want to be appeased. She could collect the money he had thrown down, far more than the bill required, and call it a night. The restaurant wouldn't fault her for it, but as she stood there, clutching her notepad so tightly her knuckles whitened, something inside her stirred. A quiet, persistent voice. Maybe it was her upbringing, maybe it was empathy she couldn't suppress, maybe it was something else entirely. But she knew that if she let him walk out without a word, she would regret it. Her heart pounded in her chest as she glanced toward the door. Alexander Royce's figure loomed against the glass, the night outside casting his reflection back at him. He reached for the handle with the same precision he did everything else, ready to vanish into the darkness of the city. Layla's lips parted, but no sound came. She swallowed, her throat dry. She could feel the weight of the entire room behind her, the watchful eyes of strangers who would think she was foolish for even trying. He was a billionaire. She was a waitress. Their worlds didn't intersect, not here, not anywhere. And yet, her pulse raced. She took a breath, deep and steady, and stepped forward.